let's pivot to the kind of postmodern capitalist condition.
Okay.
Uh, I just read or I retweeted someone that was responding to a Compact Mag article pointing out that queer theory and capitalism are quite fluid and interchangeable and kind of reinforce each other. And someone had found a liberal economist by the name of Deirdre McCloskey, who is a trans individual, I believe, a trans woman, and saying that postmodernity and capitalism actually do nicely dovetail. Uh, what do you think of that? I think capitalism does lend itself to this kind of a liquid modernity, constant upending of narratives quite well, far more so than communism, at least historically. So I think there's something to that notion of capitalism and postmodernism being sort of kissing cousins.
Well, yeah, I mean, it leads straight into Frederick Jameson, yeah, with postmodernism, the cultural logic of late capitalism. Yeah, that's a quite famous book, I think, from 1990. So Jameson he's very old now. He's in his 80s, I think.
Oh,
yeah, but he's one of the, I suppose, most well-regarded kind of left-wing academics, I suppose, in terms of sort of veteran academics in America. And yeah, he was basically saying that he saw postmodernism as a kind of development of capitalism coming out of the Second World War, and kind of arriving around about the late 50s, early 60s, so that you have a kind of a shift. I mean, he doesn't sort of pinpoint it very simply in terms of just flowing from the economic system, sort of just the sort of classical Marxist way of saying it's the means of production, produces postmodernism, but something a bit more complicated, a bit more Hegelian, maybe, so that we end up in a situation where there is this kind of a free-floating culture which is no longer connected to tradition or to necessarily, nature. Yeah, so you've gone beyond nature, and you live in a kind of a culture which is kind of its own reference point, in a sense.
That connects with me in terms of how every individual is kind of a brand right now. I mean, anyone who has social media accounts kind of considers himself to some degree a brand. Does that fit in there?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter, of course, and I suppose I've sort of self-consciously positioned myself in different ways over the years, sort of been there for 4 years. Not changing radically, really, just nudges here and there, I might say. But yeah, I mean, Jameson was kind of looking at things in the late 80s, early 90s, and he was kind of noting things like, that corporations have become multinational. So that they weren't really rooted in nations anymore.
right.
They don't really care about national traditions or anything like that. They just use them as a sort of skin suit, as you say sometimes.
I think of the way that Ford Motor Company looms large in the American, imagination. That is like a rooted company. Now I'm sure that's a multinational as well, of course, by now. The idea of a company having a kind of you think of its origin story and it feels inextricably tied to a particular nation. More and more of the companies now. I mean, I worked for a global IT solutions provider named Accenture for a while. Now, what can you even guess where in the no particular country comes to mind when I think of that, or like, Strike Force Global Security Solutions, whatever, CrowdStrike. More and more of these companies are comprised of sort of regionless concepts that aren't connected to any nation's history that I can discern, And I think
that's right. Yeah. And I think it's kind of considered a bit sort of gauche to have very kind of rooted associations now. I mean, I just noticed, I think yesterday, the Oxford Publishing House, Oxford University Publishing, had changed their logo. So they had originally, you probably can vaguely remember it, kind of like this Latin motto with some books, in a kind of shield type affair, very traditional. They got rid of that, and now they've got this sort of liquid modernity kind of, circle. So yeah, they've kind of, they've joined this kind of placelessness, right? Of I don't know what we call it, 21st century capital, maybe.
This isn't to say that it's necessarily bad. A lot of the liberal economists will say that we're constantly reimagining, say like an origin story. I use the word origin story for Ford Motor Company, but what these companies are might represent. The new Oxford might tap into someone's sort of historical consciousness or somehow a socially driven conception of why it has value that isn't related to a nation, but is also somehow good and sort of works for them, right? And I think the kind of people who are doing these rebranding must be thinking about that. Do they think if we change this Oxford logo, we're nothing anymore? I mean, we had a certain identity before, now we have no identity. They must not be thinking that. But I don't think they're thinking global identity either. That's part of the rhetoric, but they typically have some kind of story they're trying to generate. And
I will say that probably every company has and knows very well, is very intimate with who exactly their customer base is, and that will probably play into this a lot. I think that if you are, I don't know, a shoe company, and you very much market to the fact that you have a great soccer club or something, that's going to be relevant to that. I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about also like YouTube. Clearly, it's a company that's based in America, but I was listening to a podcast yesterday, the Quillat podcast, actually, about in India. It's a huge market now on YouTube, like ginormous, because they have like over 1 billion people there, right?
I'm seeing more YouTube reaction. I watch a lot of YouTube reactions to movies. If you just put movie reaction, you search in YouTube. You clear your history and just start from scratch. Maybe a third of them are Indian films now, and you see Americans
the thing
watching them.
I was also going to say that apparently this guy from India was being interviewed on this podcast, and he was saying that if you went back 5 or 10 years, people in India who just had their YouTube channels, they would be talking in English, and they would be trying to gain a Western audience, because that's where the audience was. And that's no longer the case. Now they're speaking just specifically to Indian audiences, because the audience is there, and they can they don't care what American audiences think of them anymore, because there's more people in India, way more, and they speak they speak their language, and they have cultural references, and I mean, so that's kind of a huge example to me of a country turning inwards rather than outwards. I think that these things very much depend so much on the specifics, what specifically you're talking about.
Yeah.
I kind of have no sense on the grand narrative. To go back to a shoe example, Adidas is clearly based in Germany. They're never gonna give up on the fact that they're a German company, ever. That's so ingrained.
I actually did not know that they were.
Oh, really? Oh, funny.
So
okay, well.
the famous 3 stripes that I associate with middle school and high school. You had to have those cool shoes.
Very true. Yeah.
So it just because I associate it with my American middle school experience, I think of it as American. And of course, that's what a lot of professionals aiming for. They're aiming to generate a love of a product, or that taps into a kind of lifestyle that could occur anywhere in theory, not just in a given nation. So, but yeah, Frederick Jameson talking about multinationals, which I guess were really coming into their own in the 80s and 90s. 80s primarily really reached global village level zeitgeist in the 90s. I remember the AT&T commercials showing people speaking around the world, and they were really tapping into the we're connecting everybody. So yeah, that was the 80s and 90s when the notion of the American corporation and everything it sort of stood for culturally becoming divorced from America per se, and becoming a sort of globally aligning people. business and
Right.
When America like sorry, one more comment. When America brands something as made in America, do we still market those products abroad as proudly made in America? Like so often you go to a store, even a Target, and it's like proudly made in America, you know? This T-shirt proudly made in America. When that is sold in a foreign country, even Canada, like is it still proudly made in America, or is that only sold to us in that respect?
You're in Poland.
I have to say I've never seen any label like that saying "proudly made in America." Some other countries,
Okay, yeah, because
yes,
I see it a
but not
lot. Yeah.
America.
Well, I remember during George W. Bush's reign, it was embarrassing. You wanted to play down how much something was associated with America. Um, that is like on the back burner, I think, and maybe not even just on the back burner. I mean, it might not come back. I'm surely in some capacity, but I think the whole ugly American thing, it's really sort of diminished. I mean, even with Trump phenomenon, people would sort of single out Trump and his people and separate that from America at large. That really wasn't the case with, say, the Republican Party and just all of the U.S. through the 80s and 90s. I think the peak was in the 2000s. That was the last gasp of like, oh, America in general just sucks. And then now, like the things that are bad about America, they you find a bit of that in Europe as well. So there's like mega Italy, mega Sweden. Russia is now thought of by a lot of people stateside as like a snowy 51st state full of Republicans. So America as sort of like America per se is this kind of imperialist or cultural hegemon, this negative force in the world. That's all breaking up now. You know,
Well, I think as well the thing with like wokeness or I don't know what you want to call intersectionality. It's kind of not strictly speaking associated with America.
right.
You know,
It does come from here, but people don't think of it as coming from here in the same way that they think of evangelical Christians and guns coming from here.
right. It's just kind of like the West, it's associated with the West
Yeah.
more vaguely, I think, kind of sort of floating over the world, really. And I think there are people who hate it for sure. I mean, a lot in Russia, I think. And there are some people who just find it, of no consequence, right? They just sort of ignore it. But it's not seen in the same way as kind of an American product, I think, as we, was seen, things were seen in let's say 2000s when we had the Iraqi, war.
Yeah.
And all those, the brands, popping up in Iraq, and McDonald's and stuff like that. So that was kind of images of American imperialism, but it's not seen quite in that way anymore, I think.
Yeah, it's identity politics and that kind of thing was born here, but it's not exclusive to here anymore. And even if most of the discourse and energy around it is still generated here, there are too many sort of fellow travelers throughout the English speaking world who are on board for it to be thought of as uniquely American in the same way that like radical libertarianism is radical free market libertarianism. That's another kind of school of thought that okay, that's very American. It has
Right.
like the faintest presence in the Anglophone, but it's really very very quite American.
I do think that people in power, political power especially, I think that they really do have, top of mind for a lot of conversations, the idea of soft power and how you influence another country is through things like, getting your authors translated into their language, getting your television shows, put on their television stations, getting your companies to have headquarters there. I do think that is like a big part of global politics still. Like when I personally when I think of any other countries, I immediately think of what brands exist there, like South Korea, like Kia, things like that. I name a country, the first thing that's going to come to my mind is some sort of a brand, and like that's totally intentional. I really do think that like people in power made that the case, so that's soft power. Let's say, oh, I should probably check out Japan because they have cool like, movies that come out of Japan. Like, that's huge. I think that, like, that is real power, almost more so than like political power. Do you guys disagree? Like, kind of the premise here is that you would disagree with that, but I'm kind of curious.
I mean, I don't disagree. I think this is kind of the order that has existed since the Second World War, that commercial power, kind of brand recognition is the key thing, really, and has been, like since the Second World War. And I think most countries just recognize that. I mean, I think even the Soviets recognized that eventually, right? That they tried to develop their own kind of brands, car manufacturing, and so on. Of course, they couldn't do it. Their economy wasn't, anywhere near efficient enough to do that. They tried that in Poland too. We got some homegrown brands of cars and things like that here, which were only sold here, really. I mean, you've got, like, East Germany, you've got the Trabant, right? That was a kind of iconic car in the Eastern Bloc. My in-laws have still got some items, made in the GDR. It says, like a barometer in the flat. So there was a bit, like, within the Eastern Bloc, there was a bit of that kind of capitalism in a sense, that they were aiming to sort of develop their reputation for making certain things, but it wasn't in the same way as in the West, or in places like Japan, Southeast Asia, where you have that sort of postmodern capitalism of the brand is everything, really. Where it's taking over, really, from the sort of use value, as the Marxists say, where you have then much more important is kind of associations in your mind, these imaginative associations, BMW or Audi or Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola represents freedom, or it represents liberty, So
that is so dumb when you say it out loud, isn't it? Coca-Cola represents freedom.
It sounds ridiculous, but I mean, it works, right? I mean, they managed that. I mean,
right.
Even I read an anecdote from the Second World War with the Russians, with the Soviets, and Zhukov, General Zhukov, was a big fan of Coke, but he couldn't be seen to be drinking Coke, so the Coca-Cola company specifically made a clear version for him, like lemonade.
So there was not only a Pepsi Clear, but there was a Coke Clear,
just for him,
in a very limited run. For this.
Right, wow. That's it, just for the general.
Wow.
Right? It's amazing. But I think as well that Pepsi was sold after the war. Pepsi was sold in the Eastern Bloc, but Coke not, because Coke was just too American,
Yeah. So what is actually, this might seem like it's coming out of nowhere, but it's certainly related. What is a good rebuttal to the classic communist line? Why do you need more than 2 forms of deodorant? Why do you need more? Why must there be such a panoply of products that serve the same function, essentially?
Okay.
Why?
Well, I suppose, classically speaking, you have competition, right? In theory, the more manufacturers are making something, with their own spin on it, then the better the consumer is, right? The better off they are. But I think this is, now we're seeing the kind of limitations of that view, that there's so many areas of life which are dominated by one single company now. Google dominates search, right? Especially in IT, big tech. They have these dominant sort of sectors. The company dominates a particular sector. And they seem to be collaborating sometimes. Yeah, it seems to me that they're kind of working together.
If you think about Google, okay, it's a monopoly, but what a strange kind of monopoly, because everyone sort of intuitively understands why there shouldn't be just one company that makes shoes. Even if they make shoes in different styles and stuff. But it's harder to understand why there can't be one company that allows you to do things like look up other companies and a whole other stuff. Like Google's like a portal for information. It's a bit more difficult getting someone to understand why there should be multiple portals of information, more so than it is difficult to understand why there should be more than one restaurant. Or what shoe
I mean,
company.
when you say should, is it like the government dictates that? Oh, someone did search, so no one else can do search. I mean, where does that?
Yeah,
Like,
forget about who might solve the problem, but I'm saying that like people understand why having one restaurant or one kind of food or one shoe company is bad. They couldn't imagine living with such limited options. But why
right.
should there be more than one place to go on this thing called the internet to look up a bunch of stuff that you want to look up? I don't know. It's a bit more difficult, I think, to get people to think of why search engine monopoly is bad. It's too new a kind of product, or it's too new a kind of service, product or service. That gets into another thing. How do we know if it's a product or service really? And that gets
Well,
back to capitalism's postmodernity. It's generating all new categories constantly that make it difficult to apply old models of, in this case, monopoly. Why it should be bad.
well, if you think back about 20 years ago, when Google was really establishing itself, I think they did something rather brilliant, sort of, I mean, in terms of very intelligent, that they kind of advertised themselves or promoted themselves as a sort of public utility. And that's
Oh,
how we came to think of them, I think. So Google is something like the water company, or.
it's like a phone book, which was
Right.
you know.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of search engines in the late 90s, right? Around about 2000, there were still quite a few. And they gradually got, bumped off one by Google, really. And we didn't really mind because we were thinking, well, Google's just the one that does it best, right?
Yeah.
So, but now, I mean, I see a lot of people on Twitter saying Google is, rubbish compared to what it was 10 years ago. It's heavily filtered, it's censored, etc., etc. So yeah, I mean, when you get into a monopoly situation, you're held over a barrel, right? I mean, you no longer have the consumer's kind of power to choose something else. You just have
It
to
is
go with what.
interesting. I mean, that like kind of fundamentally Google operates on an algorithm. If they really wanted to monopolize search, it is interesting that they could like have multiple algorithms that you could toggle between. And so, I mean, like Joe Rogan, this is a talking point of his that you like certain things are censored by Google, right? So let's say like Google like actually does, they could own another algorithm that like just doesn't censor specific things, and they could like really lean into a monopoly there. Having a specific algorithm that pleases specific political parties. Who knows if they even do it? Maybe they even do that because they know our political parties. If you go on Facebook or Google and look up your profile, it'll say like what age you are, what you're into, what political party you're affiliated. And it's right. It's like always, I mean, I've looked it up several times. It's like it knows who I am better than I do. It's very goofy. Just because I'll like a Bernie Sanders post or
Like
something, you know what I mean? But it aggregates all these data points and it knows me personally so well. It could have my algorithm, that feeds me or it could have the Joe Rogan algorithm so he shuts the fuck up about this talking point and never mentions it again, right?
Yeah, I was looking at this Reddit forum I frequent called the Mott. They were talking about looking up the term mass formation psychosis. Remember when that was a thing a little while ago?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, and like apparently like the definitive paper on it or article or whatever is difficult to find on Google. But if you use Brave browser and put on or use there's something in beta that got called goggles that skews it toward conservatives, toward like the right or just I guess heterodox left, and that's all similar face now. If you do that, it comes up like right away. So it's difficult for me to really
I'm sure that's true. You know what I mean? I really don't doubt that at all. Yeah.
yeah. So Vox articles or whatever criticizing it come up. They rank high,
Right.
and then somewhere
Right.
on page 17 you might find the original. Right?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I guarantee people are have a heavy hand on specific topics. for various, sometimes it's about lawsuits. The company doesn't want to be sued. Other times it is just like, I don't know. I've worked at some of these companies, and it's like people's political agendas do kind of, they show themselves, in subtle ways. It's kind of obvious.
Yeah, when I worked at Google, I was kind of doing taxonomy for various advertisements, apps, and mobile banking apps and things like that, but also just YouTube videos that people would post, and like baked right into the policy cake for Google as far as identifying hate were very specific terms. The Wuhan virus. This was about the time when I was there working on that. So it was very topical. Like it would spring up. We would be trained on how to look for that, or you have to flag it or something, and then they would redact it. Like the next update on that particular deck where you're looking at wouldn't include that stuff. It just in general, what they define as hate or extreme, it touched on certain right-wing themes more so than left-wing themes. So like hating the rich is not extreme. And like, disparaging whites, no, that can be lumped into like the civil rights effort. But criticizing asylum seekers, that gets roped under racism. That's extreme. So at kind of a high level, like it is skewed against a lot of the things that the right cares about. It's just verboten inherently. So I see how they do kind of stack the deck. But what's gotten new over the last decade is just kind of playing whack-a-mole with each news of the day, like specific terms. You have to find that thing. Hunter Biden laptop, all of that. So they're not wrong. The conservatives are not wrong, but unfortunately, a lot of them don't work in that space, and even I'm sort of peripheral to like the hardcore stuff. And they're not wordsmiths. I think Democrats generally are more intelligent. So the way that the conservatives describe these things makes them sound like they're full of shit, but they're not. They intuit it correctly,
I do know that there are plenty of instances of left-wing things that also just get weeded out by algorithms. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but like David Pakman has kind of run through a list of them before and say,
Israel Palestine is easily
that's one. Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, I do need to run, guys, but thanks for inviting me on.
Okay,
dude.
yeah, we over an hour. Yeah. So thanks, Peter.
All right, thanks.
Take care.
Great to see you.
You too.
Take care, man.
Bye.
So big developments in the past couple of weeks, as I'm sure the listeners are aware. So there was a big breakthrough in the east of Ukraine. The Russians were forced back pretty rapidly in, I think, where was it? Kharkiv region, I think. Kharkiv region, yeah. So the Ukrainians took back quite a lot of territory. They say 6,000 square kilometers. Huge swathe of territory. And the Russians now, I think it's already started, but they are conducting so-called referendums in 4 territories, I think. Luhansk, Donetsk.
Oh, right. Yeah, and Putin has encouraged that quite heartily, I think.
Right. Yeah. So obviously they're going to come back almost 100% in favor of joining Russia. Then we can assume the Russians will annex those territories, and Putin has threatened to use, I don't know, I don't think he said it explicitly, but we can assume nuclear weapons to defend the territorial integrity of Russia, because then it will, in the Russians' eyes, that will be Russia, right? So it's pretty tense. I think it's the most tense it's been since the beginning of the war, really.
Yeah, I remember people predicting it would be over quickly, that Russia would come in there and do their thing and quite securely hold down at least the eastern half of the country, and then it more or less stay that way. But I don't know. I'm getting concerned now about like the nuclear brinksmanship stuff. And so, I mean, I mentioned before about the in the U.S. having a national self-interest point of view on this. Like, I don't want Putin to aim nuclear missiles at the U.S. I think that's much less likely than something happening over in that region of the world that implicates people who are not Russian or Ukrainian, but also not the U.S. So there's kind of an international, like, anti-nuclear peacenik way of being critical of the pro-Ukraine, pro-U.S. side of this without being pro-Putin. It's kind of kind of an old school liberal Doctors Without Borders type of thing that I'm sympathetic to. That makes sort of somewhat overlap with the Russia hawks, weirdly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sort of heavily pro-Ukraine. I mean, because of where I am, or where my family is, I'm not really keen to see Russia win.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't think, kind of like a decisive defeat for Russia is really in the best interests of most of the world, really. Because that could be very dangerous, I think. I mean, if there's a rapid, sort of Ukrainian advance, and the Russians are really getting hammered, we don't know what's going to happen in that situation. It's quite a dangerous situation, especially if, say, Putin is deposed and somebody else takes his place. Now he's actually initiated a so-called partial mobilization in the past few days, and there's been apparently that it's reserves are being called up, but I'm not sure if it's only limited to reserves, people who have already had training.
It's a little unclear because I've heard it described as people with military backgrounds, but I think they have universal service there, right? When you're 18 or whatever, when you're young, you have to do some time in the military.
Right.
So,
I mean, I've seen the number of 300,000. 300,000 reserves. I've seen some footage from, sort of far east of Russia, I think, with people, saying goodbye to their menfolk. I mean, it's really sad to see. I hate to see this kind of thing happening, really.
Protesters were being forced to enter the war, which was pretty amazing.
Right. They were arrested, and then
they would not be on board.
Right.
Psychologically, they'd be completely checked out. So they would seem to make terrible soldiers, but if the effect is to just limit any further protests, then I suppose they can deal with a tiny portion of the.
I think so.
Out there
it is the scare, though. Yeah, it's the scare of any potential protesters, really. Yeah, I mean, I called it on Twitter a sort of foul war, and I really think it is awful. The destruction, the death and destruction of it all is just horrible. And I think, the best thing would be some kind of settlement, really, some kind of negotiated peace. I mean, if that means some territories go to Russia, maybe that would be for the best, really.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because that's a perfectly consistent line. I mean, you think back on all the wars that the U.S. has been involved in, and like let's just like peace now. Like, okay, that's a sort of a noble third way, although it was usually aligned more with the left or the political party here, the Democrats, and so but now it's really tough to kind of promote that line without thought of as being some kind of crypto trad mega person,
right.
You could be a perfectly so I don't know exactly what I would do if I were certainly in Russia. I know that I think there are people there with kind of techie jobs like myself, and I think they're exempt. They'll probably be some of the last to be forced to go if they are. So I would not.
Yeah. I mean, I've noticed, that the quality of debate about all issues, really, I think, has rapidly declined over the past 10 years or something. Where you just got this polarization, and any kind of nuanced position is being thrown out the window, really. And if you try, to put forward the sort of case, well, maybe we should make peace with Putin, on these terms, just give him a kind of way of saving face, so he doesn't do anything drastic. And you're going to say, well, they're going to say, oh, you're a pro-Russia, you're a traitor, etc., etc. And I think that obviously that would have been said probably in the Second World War as well. But there are many wars where that wouldn't have been said, since then, where there would have been more rational debate, I think, about the situation and people accepting certain positions as valid, and considering them without this kind of very polarized discourse, which we now have about everything, really, about the trans issue, about abortion, about anything you can name, really. It's just, there's only one way or another way. It's like, and if you try to say something a bit more, subtle, a bit more nuanced, you just get thrown into one of the camps, right? And it's impossible, and it's just incredibly frustrating and stupid, really.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast. I think it's about critical media studies, which isn't a very specific name for a podcast. It just sounds like a course you take in college. But they were talking about the way that left discourse plays out online and how theory people, capital T, the kind of strong the podcast host dichotomized between strong theory and weak theory, and weak theory is basically tailor-made for the Twitter experience. It's kind of pragmatic. It's about identifying allies, distinguishing allies from enemies, trying to get someone to make kind of a concrete, actionable point, and not just sort of think for its own sake and explore for its own sake, and certainly not steel man the other side argument. Right. So weak theory prevails on Twitter, and I think in a way that's how one could paraphrase what you're discussing here. The weak theory dominates.
Right. And weak thinking, I'm afraid, I mean, often on Twitter, I've criticized, the kind of prevailing theories, which are often conspiracy theories. No, not sort of completely against conspiracy theories. I have discussed them on my Substack about the Gulf War, for example. But I think sort of conspiracy theory as a sort of overarching framework to explain everything, which increasingly people seem to reach for.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've sort of thought that conspiracy theory is this sort of the kind of leftover ideology. We think of right-wing ideology, left-wing ideology, but then there's a kind of a conspiracism in general. It doesn't seem to have solid grounding like a lot of left and right traditional political philosophical theories do. It clearly has a theory of what certain actors have been doing on certain concrete events, but it has no underlying explanation for why political actors would systematically behave in certain ways. I don't think a lot of conspiracists even see anything particularly systematic, unless you want to say systematically destroying the people or something. It's just they just kind of hop from one event to the next. And unlike left or right, which has a theory, often have theories as to what motivates actors, sexual competition, economic competition if you're on the right, or well, even if you're on the left, it kind of, the oppressed versus the oppressor, economically, racially, however you want to might elucidate that. Conspiracism doesn't seem as well grounded, but it's taken over so much that it's kind of like the general populist ideology, if it were, and it's absolutely tailor-made for a nonstop flow of news events, which is the kind of environment we live in now. So I think it's winning.
I mean, Kerwin has rejoined us. I'm interested to know, what sort of role conspiracy theory plays in Hungary.
Sorry about that. I've got the Eastern European internet special deal, so
coming back.
They kind of screwed me over there. what role conspiracism has in Hungary? Well, I don't know. I think it actually is pretty significant among the population, but the issue with it is that unfortunately, the kinds of people who I think are attracted to conspiracy theories are not going to know English and thus won't be very available to me, since my Hungarian is like preschool level at this point. It does seem to play a role, I think a significant role. I remember I was at a bar and I was discussing I was basically parroting the realist argument for why the United States is more to blame than Russia for the Ukraine situation. I was just kind of stating their perspective, and some guy overheard us, and my friend was translating what he was saying, and he was like, "Oh, I'm interested in what you're telling me. Do you know about the Rothschilds?" And he absolutely wanted to get into a discussion about the Rothschild banking family and various ideas. What were you saying about conspiracies and how they play a role in society, Dane? It seemed like you were making a very strong point.
Well, I was saying that so the traditional left and right ideologies are sort of better grounded as to a theory of what motivates actors in society, just in general. Whereas conspiracy doesn't seem to go that deep. It just sort of posits some nefarious actors screwed over people for, I guess, just kind of a generalized love of power. And also that conspiracy theory is kind of the perfect, somewhat ideology-free ideology of our day, because it's made to tackle like the nonstop flow of news events. It's more like journalism is conspiracism's friend more so than political theory, political philosophy. So journalism provides fodder to conspiracy theorists and conspiracism in a way political philosophy doesn't. It's sort of orthogonal to that and doesn't help them that much. Because so much of conspiracy is made up of explaining one event after another. Political philosophy is not as much.
Yeah, well, my question in that, I think I agree with you. I think you're right that journalism absolutely does feed conspiracy theory, but I far more than any academic work does. But my question is, do you think that on some level the conspiracy theorists are giving a rational response to the bombardment of information that they're constantly inundated with, as well as the social expectation that they're supposed to have some sort of opinion on everything when it's all, in fact, rather out of their control? It seems to me that the whole premise of conspiracy theory thinking is, well, we've got some guys in power, they're controlling everything. They're the ones who are always going to be on top. We're always going to be at the bottom. They're kind of doing everything. And therefore, we're alleviated from having to really take a whole lot of responsibility of much. And if that's the position, I can actually kind of see where they're coming from and sympathize with it to a great degree.
I think it can be. I think a lot of the popularity of conspiracism much of it does trace back to just increasing societal complexity. The fact that I think any one person will have less of an impact on the flow of events than ever before. All of that fuels conspiracy. But you mentioned a second ago, the conspiracist says these people in power, right? So they don't have a very well fleshed out theory of why these people are pursuing power in that way. It's just kind of a generalized, they want to screw someone over. Whereas left or right has, for instance, the right will describe a lot of the left's quest for power as being people who are not particularly skilled or competent, lashing out in an envious way against people who are better than them. Something like that, right? So that's something systematic that allows you to predict how people will behave going forward. Conspiracism is just kind of like, they take for granted who is on top and already, not so much how they got there, except for other shady activities. They don't have a theory as to what really motivates them that isn't just a lust for oppression, as expressed in one news event after another.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely right. I think that that's completely right. I think the only, I guess the question is, what do people really expect from them exactly? I mean, I think that it's always interesting when you get like one guy out of the huge mass of them that thinks like, well, I can make a difference. There are these pedophiles at a pizza restaurant, so I'm gonna bring my shotgun and kill them. Haha. Like it's weird when one guy decides that the time to act is now and
Yeah.
destroy the reptilian overlords or whatever. But back in the United States, I lived in the deep South, and a lot of my friends were into conspiracy theories, and it always they always straddled the line between acknowledging that a lot of it is fake and a lot of it's just people, magnetic personalities, hamming it up and engaging in a kind of showmanship. But then also there was a kind of agreement with what was actually being said, and the ambiguity was part of the appeal. It was like, oh, this guy Alex Jones is ridiculous, but then on the other hand, they're like, no, but it's really true. Like, the pizza pedophile people are real. I don't know. Like, I
Yeah.
think that I always interpreted it as a kind of theory of power that allows you to not have a theory, and then just kind
Right.
of a way to partake in the enjoyment of the news, in a situation, a hopeless situation in which you have to be aware of it at all times. I think a lot of people in some ways would prefer not to have to, and not have to have that social expectation foisted upon them.
Yeah, I've always been actually a bit intimidated by certain single issue conspiracists because they often have a lot of information on their hand. I almost said facts. I can't really verify that, but they will inundate you with detailed explanations. And I've always thought it was sort of like the kind of bougie, college educated, not the conspiracy theorists aren't college educated, many of them are, but the kind of bougie dismissal of a conspiracy theory. Where like, that's just stupid, though. I mean, the fact is that this person has at least looked into this particular topic, and just kind of hand waving them away is not very satisfying. Even all my instincts think that the college person wanting to dismiss it is correct. So I've been intimidated in the past by getting into kind of spats with conspiracy theorists because often they know a lot and they're very bright people, but they're not applying that to the sort of foundational political philosophy. They
Do you
are
try to argue with
more
them?
like a rogue journalist the way they talk.
Do you attempt to argue with them?
In a polite way. It's sort of like I'll ask sort of like generic questions that I can bounce off of them. I try not to be that's just stupid. I mean, unless it's really, really egregious. I don't know, lizard people or something like that. I'd probably just sort of try to bow out entirely. But uh,
Yeah.
things like crisis actors in the Sandy Hook shooting or something like that. I had a conversation with a friend the other night about that, and I didn't get too up on my high horse and get pissed off about it. But if you don't do that, if you try to be a little more um, kind of agreeable and polite, you end up looking a little patronizing too. So I guess I probably did that, but I didn't. I certainly try not to get all incensed and pissed off with them.
No, I just tend to go with it. I just take their givens, and I'm like, oh yeah, but what about this? I don't know. I just kind of
Right.
like egg them
Yeah.
on
Like,
in my
keep
own
the
terrible
conversation
way.
moving along, but and I'll be like, that's just stupid. Let me guess, you read InfoWars and then just let that do the job for you. Okay, and then especially there are onlookers who will hear you go InfoWars and then you win because of just lazy social proof. It's just that's what's really annoying. So even if I don't agree with the conspiracy theorists, I have some sympathy for them being weird underdogs that are very easy to laugh off and to put into.
Yeah, I don't know. I would agree. I kind of in a way see them as the underdog, and there's always like varying degrees of seriousness. I'm not even entirely positive. Like, I'm not entirely pleased with how conspiracy theory has come to be defined over time. There is a kind of facetious logic, and I do think that the conspiracy theorists who believe in like the reptilian overlords or whatever do have some sort of obsession with power that often wavers back and forth between wanting to shun it and also wanting to assume it. I mean, I used to go to a laundromat, and this homeless guy once went up to me and was telling me about the Illuminati. And the way he described them, he made them sound like the worst thing in the world. And I was like, damn, these Illuminati guys are up to no good. And he was like, no, I'm a member. I'm one of them. Like my great-great-grandfather.
Yeah.
So, and I was like, oh, shit. So I don't know. Like, it's to me, I've kind of come over time to see it as a defense mechanism generally for the fact that nobody really wants to be in the position of having to opine on everything, and just coming up with this simple heuristic is just the best way to go about doing it, and to make some sense of an extremely complex amount of information that one has to stay abreast of in day-to-day life. But you're right that there are these single issue guys that get really, really in the deep end about it. Like the flat earthers are fascinating to me. Well, I once like read Flat Earth Theory for like a good hour and a half, and I found it fascinating because it required it's not a theory in which you're lazily responding to some like atavistic impulse where you're like, oh, I'm going to go back to being 5 years old and think simplistically. It's not that at all. If you want to think like a flat earther, it actually requires more mental discipline and a greater deal of strenuous abstraction than it is to just accept that the world is round. So there's some sort of motivation in some of these things. It might just be the desire for esoteric knowledge or whatever else. It might just be because there's a lot of fun in just pretending to assume a position that requires you to reorient everything you know about the world. Like, this is something educated people do too. Like, have you ever, like, I would guess that because everyone in this discussion is pretty smart, I bet at some point in your life you've like taken on a new belief that has required you to redesign your vocabulary from the ground up. Like, I'm not going to say this anymore. I'm going to say that instead. I don't want to call it this. I'm going to call it that. And you like catch yourself in conversation like, it's this. No, I mean neoliberal, or whatever the word is. And there's a kind of fun in that when you take on a new identity.
I used to do that with the word capitalism. Libertarianism, and then I said I'm going to describe everything around me as state capitalism. It's not the real thing.
Yeah, but when you do that, the discipline of doing it is what hardens you and gives you a kind of new approach to the world. You're seeing the world through an entirely different array of symbols and symbolic speech with which you express yourself. I mean, there's a kind of joy in that in and of itself. So even then, like, even when you look at it that way, I can kind of appreciate some of these more bizarre theories, provided they don't, do anything stupid.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, being on Twitter, you become very conscious of how you describe things, the vocabulary you use, and you sort of come to realize that if you use certain words, like I was kind of got into some kind of argument with one of the right wingers called Scott Greer. Yeah, you might know him.
Oh, is that the guy that says Scott Greer 6'2" or something like that?
Yes, something like that. Yeah, that's him. And anyway, I was saying something about rentier capitalism, right, as a problem. And he was saying that, it's not a problem. It's not a problem. And I knew, it's because he's a rightist, and he's an American rightist, that anyone says something about capitalism, and it cannot possibly be a problem with capitalism. But if I had explained it, if I had described it in some slightly different ways, maybe he would have, been more open to that, right? But you got to think about his own audience is watching him, so he can't be seen to agree with somebody who says there's a problem with capitalism, right? So.
But you end up sometimes you end up having a problem where like you change the terminology, but you yourself know that it's a bit disingenuous because what you are getting at is still something you feel your interlocutor would dislike, and so sometimes I'll catch myself changing the terminology to be more palatable, but I know in my heart of hearts that I'm still getting at something or going after something or promoting something that this person wouldn't like, so it feels kind of fraudulent,
Right, yeah. But you just notice, that there are all these tribes on Twitter, and when you cross one of these boundary lines into somebody else's territory, the words that you were using with your own people, let's say, suddenly become, kind of problematic for that person, even though you think to yourself, well, it's just describing a situation, right? It's just describing how things are. That's all, yeah. But for them, it has some other implications. So, I mean, it's all, there's all kinds of theory on Twitter about signaling, isn't there? About in-group and out-group. And you become very, very conscious of that, I think, when you're on Twitter.
I still kind of wrestle with that whole idea of virtue signaling, and it feels like kind of like a warmed over libertarianism. So for most of my time coming up, libertarianism was very much wedded to a kind of defense of wealth, defense of capitalism. That's been downplayed, but you still see sort of libertarian essences and arguments, and I think the signaling one is one of them, because it's still advancing a notion of like a stealth self-interest. You don't really say it because you mean it. You're saying it to look good in front of someone. And so I wrestle with how much explanatory power that has, and if it's true, does anyone sincerely believe anything? I mean, apart from the notion of signaling itself, I guess.
I think sometimes it's kind of understood in the sort of Darwinian framework, where the signaling happens just because that's how we operate. Yeah, that's how we function as animals.
Yeah.
And we're not really putting that much thought into it. Yeah, let's say. Or we're just signaling these things, because that's what, I don't know, peacocks do, or that's what, but other types of animals do. Yeah, they do signal, but they don't really think about it. They just do it instinctively.
Well, some people signal by advancing this argument of signaling, but does that not end up undermining the strength of that argument? I mean, they're just trying to look good in front of the people that. I mean, the way it actually plays out is that usually it's being lobbed at, the left, who would, in an earlier time, were already accused of being concerned about, like, the social set, the social group. Being in solidarity is a buzz term. So we already know that there's something going on there as far as wanting to be aligned with others. So accusing them of being just virtue signaling. Mm-hmm. Okay, so trying to let other people know, letting to know peer groups and social scenes and like the broader public, well, a subset of the public really, they want them to know that they are virtuous in the same way.
Yeah.
As opposed to not caring what anyone thinks and being non-virtuous. I mean, I don't know how much of a burden it really is.
I mean, people I've talked to on Twitter, they seem to either sort of lean more towards the idea that, I don't know, leftists are sort of calculating, and they're sort of calculating how best to advance, in society or in corporations and so on. Or my personal view, though, is more sort of Ballardian, I would say, that what you have is a kind of mass psychopathology. Yeah, so nobody's really, maybe a few people are sort of very calculating, but generally the whole thing operates as a kind of just a sort of madness, yeah, and people are doing it quite spontaneously. This whole, I believe in this, and I'm advancing this cause, and it's tied not only to real, what you might say, real prospects and real benefits that they can get, but to their own narcissistic idea of themselves, sort of cult ideas, really, sort of religious ideas.
Yeah, that's what's so funny about like all of the online spats. They're not real conflicts in the sense of the person your person you're arguing with on Twitter is trying to get more resources than you, or get the promotion, have money. We're all basically kind of like in the same general economic conditions. So like the attribution of your real motivation isn't about resources. Yeah, it's just pride. It's just kind of like weak stuff, really, compared to people who have real power. Oh, you just want to feel good about yourself or look good to others, or you're just stubborn in your mental habits or something. It's such a low key conflict.
Right.
The grand scheme.
I mean, I'm not saying that that these things of self-interest don't play in. Obviously, they do. But I don't think people are thinking that hard about these things. This sort of Machiavellian way usually. I just saw something about. I mean, I have to get off in a minute, but
Yeah.
This teacher in Canada, about with the big fake boobs,
Oh yeah, that.
This guy, and somebody claiming that he's there's some 4chan post which has been quoted on Twitter saying this guy is actually gaming the system. That he had been accused of toxic masculinity or something last year, and now he's trying to get himself fired in order to to sue the school for discrimination. And they claim that they know something. And of course, you have to take those all with a pinch of salt, right? But it's an example of how we you have these different views or different interpretations of what is motivating these people.
A little bit of I rely on introspection a lot to kind of figure out how plausible that really is.
Mm-hmm.
Would I go through all of that? Would I wear giant fake boobs like that, all as a ploy to undo something that happened, or turn that to my favor? I mean, I wouldn't do it.
Well, no. Well, wait. The theory is that he's wearing the big fake tits to get fired, to goad the school into firing him so that he can sue them for wrongful termination. Which would be fascinating.
I wouldn't think it's worth it to go through all that.
Yeah, because the whole problem is the payoff. Like the whole thing is like, if you're gonna do that, what would be the point if you can't be like, ha ha ha, I tricked you fools, ha ha? Because as soon as you do that, they would just like countersue you or like get you into some terrible situation. So you would just have to be known as the big titty guy with a bunch of money for the rest of your life publicly, while carrying a terrible secret. There's just no way that's the case. I can't imagine that.
But he could become some kind of trans, superstar, I suppose, with this process. It's possible.
more transvestite than transgender. Like it's so clownish. It's so clownish.
I mean, it is. I mean, it's a kind of a new extreme with that whole thing, isn't it? And it is horrifying, I think, for most of us. But
so that's in Canada, right? It would be Canada.
Yeah, Ontario. Yeah, in Canada.
Okay, well, so we're at an hour and 45 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up. Any closing statements? You guys can go ahead.
Closing statements. Two quick points. Number one, Kanye. I read a news report saying that Kanye West has never read a book. He admitted that he never read a book. And he wants to open a Donda Academy for young people, and I'm entirely in favor of this. I think that the future will involve various classes of people at different levels of illiteracy. In Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile, he talks about the importance of not teaching Émile to read until he's 9 years old. And Rudolf Steiner, I think, adopted that view. I think we should have some children who just never learn to read and should be pushed in strange and vague directions to pursue the avant-garde arts. So I'm entirely in favor of Kanye West not reading books and starting a school. I think that's excellent news. I'm very positive about it. Second, important news.
Between not reading and not reading books. Sorry, just
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes. In fact, not reading at all would be great. I think we have to engage in creative rethinking of society with entirely different levels of literacy and entirely different media media engagement. But anyways, second important news item that I found today was that Pharoah Saunders died, the great free jazz saxophonist who collaborated quite often with John Coltrane, and he released a great album in 1969 called Karma, which has the yodeling singer Leon Thomas on vocals. Dude was absolutely insane. He and Coltrane sounded a lot like avant-garde, like extreme metal or something, like 30 years before it existed. Incredible performer, and he just died, so I was kind of bummed out. And that's all I got.
Okay.
Yes.
I love music. That sounds cool. Rest in peace.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. I just say touch grass. That's it. Touch grass.
Huh. Okay. Yeah. I want to get back. I was traveling a lot early this year, touching grass quite a bit, and I want to get back to that. All right. Cool.
All right.
Talk to you later.
Cheers.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thanks for joining, Kerwin. Bye.